During its genesis in the early 70s, gaming had something of a childish connotation. Games were simple, two-dimensional, and frequently regarded as little more than playthings for the youth of the time. Kids playing games at an arcade were decidedly not English teachers, film critics, or music theorists working diligently to find meaning or technical understanding of a higher craft. To an onlooker, or perhaps even the player themselves, a day at an arcade was experientially no deeper than a day at the pool. The average game developer was not Mozart, not Walt Whitman or Martin Scorsese. They did their best to carve mustaches and mushrooms out of an 8-bit display, but certainly not to the cultural reception of a Michelangelo or Da Vinci. The average game developer was simply a passionate programmer, a maker of toys, and gaming was the red-headed stepchild of art. Like Harry Potter meekly residing under his Aunt Petunia's staircase in the titular book series, gaming would grow to coexist, albeit on the lowest rung, within its family of entertainment. With each Master Chief or Lara Croft, gaming would tentatively suggest, over many decades, that it was just as capable of etching icons into hearts and minds as any Indiana Jones or Terminator film. It wasn't until years into the 21st century, however, that perceptions would truly shift, and games would be seen as more equitable to film and literature. Video game series like PlayStation's Uncharted or The Last of Us would demonstrate to an increasingly broad audience that writers, directors, and artists who worked on games could be just as good, if not better, than their Hollywood peers. Cutscenes were detailed and filmic, while characters were complex and endearing. The Last of Us would even go on to receive a big-budget HBO adaptation, which landed to thunderous critical reception and outperformed the Game of Thrones prequel House of the Dragon. This faithful recreation of the game would go a long way to advocate for the artistic merit of its PS3 progenitor, which upon its 2013 release had already made impressive strides in that arena. This video is about Dark Souls 3, a Japanese role-playing game released to positive critical reception and an excited cult following in 2016. In the context of a rapidly evolving, money-hungry, and expansion-obsessed industry, Dark Souls 3 is also high art. Here's why. Before answering how video games could qualify as art relative to other mediums, we need to establish what makes the Dark Souls series or perhaps the most valuable contribution to its own medium. To do this, we're going to define two specific problems and how game series like Dark Souls address them. In a broad sense, the first of these problems is the increasingly vacuous nature of the average AAA video game. The second problem, somewhat tangentially, but more specifically, is how instantly gratifying these titles are. These titles, when distilled down to their core flaws, will act as the rough in which we find our diamond. To further specify exactly what kind of games I'm talking about and what makes these experiences soulless, we'll need a black and white supervillain backstory, so bear with me. The year is 2011, and a 12-year-old Scope Creep Reviews is really excited to play the newest Call of Duty and Uncharted games. His entire pre-adolescent brain revolves around Nathan Drake one-liners and Call of Duty Black Ops weapon stats, so to say he was excited was an understatement. When the games came out, they were pretty solid. In many ways, they were great even. But deep in his Xbox-addicted soul, he knew that they weren't quite the same caliber as their predecessors, and he's in something of a denial about his disappointment. Right before he has to lie to himself to enjoy his games that holiday season, his best friend introduces him to a brand new game, Skyrim. The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim is amazing to 12-year-old Scope Creep. You can actually go there vistas, sweeping score, and addicting action RPG, dungeon crawling combat sunk its claws into his brain and unplugged the dopamine stopper. He has limited understanding of game genres at this age, and he had previously tried to play The Elder Scrolls IV. He did not, however, understand why Captain Price wasn't telling him where to go and who to shoot, so he gave up. Luckily in Skyrim, there's an exceedingly large, omniscient arrow present at the top of the player's screen, so it's pretty hard to get lost. The leveling system is compelling, and the combat has a satisfying oomph to it. 12-year-old Scope Creep is thoroughly addicted and investing much more attention into this broad, larger-than-life style of game, which at this time was very novel to him. This experience, like a soon-to-be heroin addict stealing pills from a parent's medicine cabinet for the first time, was the honeymoon phase of an eventual epidemic. Fast forward to the very end of the PS3's lifecycle, and a similar attraction forms to games such as GTA V and Bungie's new IP, Destiny. Sure, Destiny was a mess on launch, and GTA 5's multiplayer would become an overly monetized hellscape eventually, but at this time, the promise of getting to sink into a deep, never-ending adventure with your friends and family put these games at the very forefront of gamers' minds, and subsequently, sales charts. There was a time right after the PS4's launch in late 2013 where the PT demo, Destiny beta, and Uncharted 4 trailer were all that console owners really had, and the 8th generation of games felt more like a big exciting promise than a consumer reality. The games were supposed to be huge, open-world endeavors that dwarfed their 7th gen predecessors, and the idea of open areas in Uncharted 4 and a fully explorable Gotham City was truly tantalizing. The open world and the average player's fascination with scope were only just blossoming. Gamers were excited, but this excitement would slowly, over the course of the generation, turn sour. Scale and connectivity were both huge selling points at E3 2013, where the 8th gen consoles were first unveiled. Games like Watch Dogs, No Man's Sky, Destiny, and the almost hilariously unfinished MGS5 falsely colored our perceptions of gaming's future upon their first showing. These titles were advertised as being interconnected, deeper, and more dynamic than what had come before. When these games finally hit store shelves, gamers were treated to a meager and incomplete shadow of what they had been initially promised. Hope for the 8th generation of consoles gave way to a certain distrust of large publishers and a sobering awareness of what they would lie about on the E3 stage. Games were unfinished, lacking soul, and obsessed with the promise of bigger with an almost willful dismissal of better. The airtight 12-hour stories of The Last of Us, Arkham City, and Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker gave way to sequels that took half decades to create and were seemingly unanimously less popular on release. Games journalists working the hype machine had to pump the brakes. Technically oriented creators who could elaborate on how exactly the games had been graphically downgraded experienced a sharp uptick in popularity. Some games were missing huge chunks of content, while others seemingly had too much. Developers like Techland, during the rollout of Dying Light 2, proudly boasted that their game had hundreds of hours of content in it, and games like Red Dead Redemption 2 included feature film-length prologue sections, all while retaining the simplistic third-person shooter combat style and fetch quest mission formatting from the original. Modern Warfare gave way to Infinite Warfare, and games grew to almost laughable install sizes. For many series, such as Assassin's Creed, the jump in frequency of release and scale of each game was juxtaposed sharply with a drop in quality. The glitchy, unplayable launch of 2014's AC Unity had fans yearning for the simplistic charisma of Assassin's Creed 2. Even higher quality, critically lauded titles were affected by that very same scope creep, with The Last of Us Part 2's main story taking over 25 hours to finish, compared to the original's much more trim 12 to 15. In fact, legendary game director Hideo Kojima was fired from Konami after his vision for MGS5 eventually cost the publisher over $80 million, and they released the game unfinished. Anyone who's been a gamer for a while now would agree. Games were certainly getting bigger, but the assumed uptick in quality, depth, and player engagement was rarely in tow. It was a slow knife, but the dream was dead. What once seemed like the promise of adventure now felt like a never-ending chore, and titles that had once, upon their reveal, jogged the imagination, ran the home stretch as an exercise in disappointment. Fast forward to February of 2021. I'm sitting in a chair, right hand on my chin, and I'm staring pensively at my PS5 home screen. I've just deleted Horizon Forbidden West off my SSD after rolling credits, and my disappointment is palpable. A review of the game would be an entirely separate topic, but let's just say the sparkly visuals and god-tier character animation didn't disguise the lackluster sci-fi plot and grindy slog the game eventually dissolves into. Maybe if it had been the first in the series, or released a decade earlier, I would have felt something aside from fatigue when I stared apathetically right through its platinum trophy. I've been a PlayStation diehard ever since my parents gifted me and my brother a PS3 and a copy of Little Big Planet, and I've proudly championed their first-party titles ever since. So this feeling I experienced, after beating Sony's newest flagship IP exclusive title, is where we harken back to our first problem. We're simply not enjoying our big games anymore. Publishers looked at early, mainstream examples of success in the open-world genre, from GTA 5 to Skyrim, and decided these experiences were the key to gamers' hearts and wallets. They then proceeded to try and emulate their success while outdoing their scope every year for a decade, with seemingly little interest in shipping what they initially advertised or attentiveness to tiring out their consumers. Delving even deeper into what makes these modern gaming experiences so vapid and exhausting, we stumble across our second problem: instant gratification. This plays into gaming in a big way, because broadly appealing, immediately rewarding game mechanics are much more prevalent in the games of today than they ever were in the 90s or 2000s. PlayStation isn't just competing with Xbox, it's competing with Netflix, Instagram, Spotify, and a whole litany of other distractions and entertainment sources. Around the early 2010s, publishers recognized players' ever-shortening attention span and feared it may impact their bottom line. So developers were tasked with catering to it, and by extension, shortening it even further. Within specific, long-standing game series, attempts can retrospectively be seen to make the experience more instantly gratifying to all players, regardless of their dedication or skill level. Things like loot boxes or specialist abilities in later Call of Duty installments would take in-game kill streaks and cosmetic rewards and hand them out to every player, when those things had previously been unlocked by completing specific in-game feats that took at least some degree of time, tenacity, or ability to pull off. Where games like Skyrim had at least made some attempt to conceal some of its larger content like the Dark Brotherhood questline, your average open-world game was more or less a grocery list of places to go, buttons to press, and simplistic combat encounters to follow up on. Games like Elden Ring and Breath of the Wild made literal headlines for not holding the player's hand through the entire open world, and it was evident that the process of a player exploring, learning, and developing skill was now an exception to the rule, where it had been foundational to gaming. Devs were rescinding obstacles to in-game rewards and prioritizing hooking players on gameplay systems as fast as possible. Publishers were consequently winning the battle for gamers' attention and were figuring out how to further monetize this victory, which they did successfully using quote-unquote microtransactions. In many titles, if a player wanted to unlock a cosmetic item but felt too bored by the game's mechanics to acquire it via gameplay, they'd likely be able to purchase it directly from the in-game store. Sometimes, players were unable to buy the exact item they had their eye on, and had to opt instead for purchasable RNG known colloquially as loot boxes, a digital box purchased with real-world money that gave the player a random cosmetic item. Content creators covering games like this would make videos of themselves enthusiastically opening these boxes to great effect, as kids who played the game were tantalized by the mechanics of opening up the boxes. The boxes, however, were expensive to buy en masse, and when kids couldn't convince their parents to let them buy as many as they wanted, a video of the boxes being opened acted as a compelling alternative. While this did further advertise loot boxes to the viewers of videos in this vein, it also demonstrated that players didn't even have to play a game at this point to be affected by their addictive nature, that at this juncture was so potent it could be experienced secondhand. Publishers eventually faced huge lawsuits for allowing minors to engage in microtransactions, with some boards going as far as to accuse EA of getting minors hooked on gambling. That first problem, the dead dream of the open world, was compounded upon and made much more potent by the expansive, shallow, and instantly gratifying nature of the content of these kinds of games. Introducing the Soulsborne genre. As you've likely surmised, the solution to both our problems, and the shorthand for games made by the Japanese developer From Software. These games are very mechanically similar to one another, and for good reason. The gameplay is unintuitive and challenging. The mechanics and story are uncommonly vague, and dying in-game is punished harshly, at least at first. These games are designed around rewarding the studious and intrepid, and require that the player isn't afraid to fail. In fact, they exist as direct contradiction to our two problems. They're dense, deeply engaging, and force the player to delay their gratification. These tendencies, which in many ways run antithetical to the characteristics of a modern video game, can easily frustrate and ward off new players. My own journey with Soulsborne games saw many years and a few attempts of various titles go by before something clicked. Initially, I had attempted to play Bloodborne when it first came out in 2015. Given my naivete, the early hours felt tense, daunting, and also not as graphically impressive as the games I was really looking forward to at the time. I didn't understand the structure and core mechanics well enough to know what my goal was, and, when combined with the general anxiety of the first area, the experience was too much pressure with not enough reward, so I quit. February 25th, 2022. I picked up Elden Ring in something of a spitefully curious post-Horizon haze, expecting to be just as disengaged and confused as I had been with Bloodborne. My perception of the Souls series at the time was, quite frankly, that it was some sort of bizarre ritualistic torture neckbeards on Reddit used to inflict upon themselves, primarily as a status symbol, or perhaps out of spite for normies and games journalists. But Elden Ring was different. The tightly packed streets of Yharnam, Bloodborne's first area, had given way to expansive flower fields. Enemies I couldn't best I could simply run from. If I stumbled onto a convoluted obstacle, I could be sure there were answers elsewhere. Elden Ring blessed my first foray into the lands between with a sense of hope and directionality notably absent from Central Yharnam. This hope eventually blossomed into a strong sense of engagement with the game. I was looking up tips and tricks, strong builds, and soul farming locations. I wanted to be as best prepared as I possibly could to beat this critically acclaimed behemoth of a title. My experience from then on was something of a cycle. Beat a boss or die to a boss and go elsewhere to seek out more power. Foes like Renala or Melania even saw me re-speccing my whole build to take the upper hand, and drawing on what I now know is controversial new mechanics and weapons like the Mimic Tear and Rivers of Blood Katana. The adventure of going online to seek advice on a boss was much more thrilling than any boss in any other game I didn't need tips and tricks for, and the sense of accomplishment and genuine progress was much more intoxicating than what I was used to. I platinumed Elden Ring around the 65-hour mark and couldn't have felt more altered by the experience. The game engaged me and inspired me in a way that a title simply hadn't in a while. Like Skyrim at the time, it was novel and exciting. Unlike Skyrim, it was equally as deep as it was wide. It acted as a dramatic antidote to the plague of vapid, instantly gratifying, soul and money-sucking time wasters that had predated it. Elden Ring felt like an essential turning point for games, and I loved every second of it. Upon completion, however, questions lingered in my mind. During my time with Elden Ring, I felt that I had been shown a glimpse of something. Perhaps it was while I was rearranging my build, or summoning my Mimic Tear, or looking up the best weapons to beat Melania. I simply wondered, what would the fight have been like with less preparation? Or with no summons? The fights were challenging enough, but I felt I had opted to experience them on a lower rung of difficulty, even if just subconsciously, out of fear of failing. What would the Fire Giant have been like without Torrent, my instantly summonable horse? Did my over-preparedness keep me from an even better experience? What had I missed? Elden Ring had introduced me to something, I knew that for sure. What I partially felt, but couldn't confirm until much later, is that it had introduced me to the most variable and uneven iteration of what it was. Upon completion, it felt like a masterpiece, a work of modern art, but perhaps with something missing. But whether it was just a little scratch on the fabric or a dramatic shredding of its best stroke, I wasn't sure. So I dove deeper into the series to find out. I picked up DS3 out of a lineup of FromSoft titles because I thought it looked the prettiest. I wanted to play a proper Dark Souls title, but I wasn't too keen to leap into one of the first two's decidedly less polished, drab 7th gen visual presentation. So off I went with the third in the trilogy. Upon booting up the first area, the game immediately differentiated itself from Elden Ring by ridding me of my Mimic Tear, my brutally powerful mage character, and my spectral steed, the three of which I had used to gleefully prance through the lands between, obliterating adversaries from a distance. This time, I was a knight with a simple sword and shield and a healing flask. The initial enemies were thankfully just as bare and basic as I was, and I was able to stride through the first area with unexpected confidence, unhindered by my new and much more intimate playstyle. Even the very first boss saw rapid defeat by my hand, despite its attempt to induce panic with its visceral attacks and a midpoint evolution from the pages of H.P. Lovecraft. From this point, the game proceeded steadily but never felt too easy, as the impish, wizard hat and sword-wielding thralls, or erratic, hyper-aggressive manservants, peppered my confident forward motion with caution and care. I loved my time with Elden Ring, but so far, my experience here was much more evenly curated and rewarding. Dark Souls 3 placed me in a notably more restrictive play space than its open-world sibling, and with that, the knowledge that I needed to best whatever was in my way to progress. The sword in my hand and the walls to my left and right imbued each new enemy type, boss encounter, and gorgeously realized area with the very same intensity my Elden Ring playstyle rescued me from. I found myself attached to bosses at the hip, frantically dodge rolling and attacking only when I perceived an opening. This newfound fear of DS3's deadly roster of bosses required me kicking my perfectionistic tendencies to the curb and finding the will to fail forward with each new dicey encounter. Fear of these imposing threats requires courage to proceed, and that courage must be partnered with tenacity, perseverance, and a willingness to study the encounter. This process eventually distills itself into relief when your foe finally falls, and eventually, after enough victories, confidence, and a very, very delayed gratification. This is Dark Souls 3's true gameplay loop, and it applies to every enemy, every area, and every boss to some degree, as well as to the grand schematic of your playthrough. I could write in detail about how this process applied to my scuffles with the Abyss Watchers, the Dancer of the Boreal Valley, or the ludicrously aggressive Pontiff Sullivan, but my most potent, challenging, and meaningful boss experience came from Dark Souls 3's optional adversary, the Nameless King. I hadn't gotten truly stuck on anything up until this point, and I knew from some prior research that the King had a reputation. I'd beaten the best of Elden Ring's bosses, but I knew in my heart of hearts that this fight would be different. I had pulled out all of the stops to beat Malenia, Elden Beast, and the Fire Giant, drawing on every resource Elden Ring offered me to see myself through, resources Dark Souls 3 simply didn't have. I attempted the King's two-part gauntlet to no avail. His giant, Phase 1 pet dragon felt erratic and out of focus. Both the King and the dragon were hammering me with attacks I could quite literally not see coming due to the vertical nature of the fight and the camera's limited scope. These attacks took huge chunks out of my health, and I was rarely able to sit my Estus without critical punishment. I eventually became frustrated, and my pleasant disposition towards what I was experiencing shifted towards disillusionment. I was putting in my attempts, paying my dues and repeating the encounter ad nauseum, but the King was simply not falling. I'm an experienced gamer. I had over 50 platinum trophies at this point, including Elden Rings. The King's trophy was only a bronze, and I felt entitled to it. My impulsivity took over, and I looked up tips on how to beat the King. I felt a bit guilty trying to take the easy way out, but that diminished quickly when I noticed that these tips were very different to what I had seen for Elden Ring. There was no Rivers of Blood, no Mage respec, and no Mimic tier. There was instead advice on where to put the camera, where to stand, and when to roll. These were different tips that gave you an encouraging nod on the way to your ass kicking, but not a get out of jail free card. They were certainly not the big red button I hoped for in my frustration, but they helped me frame the Phase 1 dragon fight in a manner that made my experience legible. I backed up and I could now read the dragon. I saw everything I needed to. I dodged when I should, attacked when I could, and eventually bested the beast. Now for the King himself. On the first attempt, I was so tapped in after beating the dragon that I almost beat the King too. Towards the end of the fight, I thought, there's no way I'm actually doing this, and then I didn't. My initial victory over the dragon and near victory over the King gave way to a downward spiral of continuous defeat, each seeing me more frustrated and more easily felled than the last. My ability to even get past the dragon again seemed to have atrophied. Eventually, again, I brushed away my pride and googled how to cheese, or beat using an unintended, simpler, exploitative method, the King, when all I was met with was a video explaining how to kill him with a bow and arrow I didn't have access to. The gravity of the situation truly set in. For the first time since I was much younger and trying to get MOABs in MW3 or beat Uncharted 2 on Crushing, I was truly challenged with an obstacle I couldn't seem to overcome. But then, something occurred to me. A method of combat I simply hadn't tried yet. Something I, as a gamer in the modern world, had not had to do in a very long time. Simply focus. I knew what I had to do. There was no easy out, no cheat code or difficulty slider, no exploitable accessibility option, no build or summon to coast on. I had to truly apply myself. I had to truly apply myself in a way that you don't in other games. I had to truly apply myself in a way that I didn't have to do by scrolling through Twitter, applying for an entry-level job, getting a passing grade in public school, or scoring a driver's license. I had to apply myself in a way that was antithetical to my life as a modern American consumer and the convenience I had grown accustomed to. I had to act with passion. I had to recondition myself. I had to take a deep breath and get the timing just right. I had to respect the King's every animation and truly play to his tempo. This wasn't Dark Souls anymore, it was the movie Whiplash. I was Miles Teller, almost giving up and then storming back in, stubborn, yet humbled, ready to give it everything he had. The King was J.K. Simmons, furiously and feverishly punishing me on every mistake, every shortcoming and panicked reaction that I had to his overbearing presence. But just like in the movie, it wasn't until the very end that I realized the King and I were working together to perfect my performance. That he was pushing me to be my very best, and I had to leave my entitlement at the fog gate and enter his arena with a true humility and respect for the musicality of both of our performances. It wasn't until the very end that I truly realized the hindrance of quick rewards and undeserved praise. It wasn't until the very end that I had looked to my own flaws for the answer, throwing my ego and compulsive tendencies away, and truly engaging myself to his dance, that I grew and really got better. It wasn't until the very end that better wasn't good enough, and the king, throwing metaphorical symbols at me like he was Joe Jones and I was Charlie Parker, pushed me to be perfect. It wasn't until the very end that I perfectly timed a dodge roll and slid behind it, stabbed him in the back, and he died. Dark Souls 3 isn't a video game. It's a cure to a plague. A coming-of-age tale for a generation kicked into the coddling quicksand of instant gratification. It's a long-awaited response to an industry that, like the once great kingdoms depicted in the Soul series, fell and rotted to its own vices. It's not a gaming experience. It's a formative one. It's a game that asks you what kind of person you want to be, and won't accept any answers except for the ones that demand more of you. Dark Souls 3 is a deeply meaningful exercise in character development. Please, do not rob yourself of this experience. Like a Mormon marching door to door, I feel that every gamer I fail to turn on to this masterwork title is a soul lost to the infernal void of microtransactions and easy modes. After over 80 hours, multiple repeat playthroughs, and a much more confident, gratifying rematch with the Nameless King, I platinum Dark Souls 3. There are people who have been with this series for years now, and probably had an easier time with the king than I did, but I have to imagine that somewhere along the way, we all had a battle that truly tested our mettle. This was mine, and I'll cherish it forever. Dark Souls 3 doesn't belong in an arcade. It doesn't belong on HBO, and even to experience it second-handedly through my review is to cheat yourself. An unassisted, thorough completion of the title would be necessary to truly experience what games can that film, literature, and music simply can't. For anyone still tentatively on the fence, anyone whose interest is piqued enough to still be here, but not quite enough to jump in, let me leave you with one last little nudge. The Dark Knight is one of my favorite movies. Its characters are deeply emblematic of different ways viewers can respond to hardship, from Batman's stoic moral code to the Joker's gleeful nihilism and Harvey Dent's fall from grace. Films like The Dark Knight ask the viewer to examine their own morals, to ask themselves which characters they relate to and why. The film acts as a timeless tale of yin and yang, dark versus light and good versus evil, one where you can find your own reflection in all of its shadows and then ask why. The Dark Knight, like many of Chris Nolan's other works, is deeply thought-provoking, self-reflective, and inspiring. And that's why I, like so many others, love the film. But that same greatly inspiring thing that it is, for the purposes of this review, is also the ceiling it hits. The Dark Knight inspires. Dark Souls 3 pushes. The Joker exemplifies. The Nameless King challenges. Harvey Dent fails. You don't have to. A TV show, movie, or musical artist at their very best can hope to inspire. We love movies where good triumphs over evil, shows where characters devolve into our darkest demons, and songs about the man in the mirror. Dark Souls 3 creates meaning where those mediums cannot, by being more than a mirror, but by sucking the player in and spitting someone else out. It doesn't illustrate, lecture, nor impart wisdom. It demands it. It doesn't tell you what you could be. It shows you what you're not, and forces you to rectify your shortcomings. Dark Souls 3 is more than modern art, because Dark Souls 3 doesn't inspire change, it requires it. Thank you for watching and have a good rest of your day.